The central scene of the play, of course, is Act 4, the one long scene there, which sees Richard hand over the crown, eventually, to Bolingbroke. In some ways, that's already been accomplished, and the scene's almost superfluous, but it's the drama of the moment that Shakespeare wants to explore, and particularly now to show the strong contrast between Bolingbroke and Richard, but also, ironically, some similarities too these are seen in this scene. So Bolingbroke, who's come to be the sort of decisive leader that Richard never was, begins the scene by questioning Bagot, and it seems like he's going to get some sort of confession from Bagot and from Armel about things that they were involved with Richard, which might further Bolingbroke's claim that Richard needs to be deposed. But instead, what he gets is a series of gauges thrown down, which take us right back to the beginning of the play. And so the play seems to be circling or spiralling around to the same point in which nobles are accusing each other of great treachery and threatening each other and wishing to engage in trial by combat. So it's hard not to feel that we haven't really got anywhere since the beginning of the play, and we're back to, indecisive leadership and petty squabbles, which may lead to greater violence and problems. In particular, it's notable that Bolingbroke, in having seen all these gauges being thrown around, and there's lots of them, says, oh, well, all this will be settled once we repeal Norfolk or Mowbray. So it seems like he's got a plan, and that's the way forward. Let's get Mowbray back, and then he can perhaps settle all these problems, give us the truth of what he knows. But then Carlisle, perhaps rather triumphantly, gives him some news. Norfolk has, and it seems like quite a bit of time has passed because Norfolk's been busy meanwhile, but he's dead. And again, as ever with Carlisle, people have to ask him what you're talking about. So there's a little humour there that whenever Carlisle talks, people have to double check what he said. Why, Bishop, is Norfolk dead? As surely as I live, my lord. And really, Bolingbroke's got no answer to that except, well, okay, all these differences will lie under gauge until we have time to assign a day of trial. It looks very much like what happened at Richard's first scene in the play, but exponentially larger. More and more problems instead of more and more solutions. However, York interrupts this, gives us a welcome distraction, and to say that Plume plucked Richard. And again, there's some language there that makes us start to both see that idea of his plume being plucked, his pride, his fanciness, but also some sympathy for him, that his character and his colour and his energy have been diminished and deprived. He's ready to hand over the crown, and you are therefore Henry IV. And you can see Bolingbroke's impatience and anxiety to get on and be king. In one sentence, he says, right, yeah, great, I'll jump on the throne. But then we get this long speech from Carlisle that says, hang on, no, don't. We don't want to see that. And he gives some warning about the blood of England, of the English, shall manure the ground. Again, another prophecy amongst the various prophecies in the play. And this one seems to prophesy those civil wars, the Wars of the Roses that will take place in the middle of the following century. And if it does, and obviously most of Shakespeare's audience will be very well aware that's what happened following these events, it's true. He's right. This is going to be the beginning of a series of factional disputes that are going to lead to a lot of unnecessary suffering and death. It's interesting that Carlisle is implacably opposed to Bolingbroke, but never actually receives the sort of summary dispatch that some of Richard's other friends do, and survives till the end of the play. However, the focus then becomes, let's get Richard, fetch him forth, so that in common view he may surrender. Again, the practicality there, Bolingbroke still has that functional approach to life, that he doesn't need certain guarantees that he should be king. And one of those is that everybody can see that Richard has surrendered, so that there's not going to be any dispute about that, or, well, he never really wanted you to be king, or he never allowed that. So he's practical and careful. And now we see that difference as Richard enters. Rather subdued, probably in quite a different costume than we've seen him before, to kind of represent that fallen state, and playing with words, speaking long, drawn-out speeches. And we see that Bolingbroke has few lines for quite a while now where he's not really allowed to interrupt Richard's show. Richard seems, again, part of his Amati, seems to be rather enjoying and self-pityingly milking this moment of surrendering power. But it's rather touching and moving, I think, too. And he says, who will say all hail to me? Nobody. And again, so Judas did to Christ. Again, there's that sense of his own self-righteousness. I'm Christ here and you're Judas. And around, again, the idea of the divine right of kings, which Richard II was particularly associated with. And Shakespeare seems to play upon that from presumably sources that he'd read. And then you get, give me the crown, and he sort of holds out the crown, but then he holds on to it so that you have this very visual moment in which Richard's got the crown in one hand and Bolingbroke's got it in his hand, and the two of them are visually sort of holding the crown between them, and he doesn't want to let it go. And so again, you get that impatience from Bolingbroke. All his lines in this little sequence, just single lines. I thought you had been willing to resign. Come on, I thought you were okay with this. Give me the crown. And then he starts playing with rather metaphorical and spiritual ideas. I can resign my crown, but I can't resign my griefs. I have to keep them because I had griefs as king, worries and concerns. Now I've got griefs about not being king anymore. So Bolingbroke tries to be rational about this. Well, you're giving up some of those griefs. It's a good thing. You're going to give up your cares and your concerns. You're not going to have to worry about things anymore. But he then starts to take that metaphor and see it as a kind of scale. And he says, well, actually, it doesn't work. Or if we see this as a well, that the crown is a kind of hole of a well and we're looking into it, it ought to work that if your cares grow, mine will diminish, but they don't seem to. My cares seem to still be with me, even if I've given some cares away to you. And again, that just impatient response from Bolingbroke. This is where we start, I think, to side more with Richard. That it's almost comical that he says, Bolingbroke, well, are you going to give me the crown or not? Come on. And then Richard torments him. I must be nothing. Therefore, no, for I resign to thee. And so he's playing, and he's kind of playing with this I meaning yes and I meaning me, and knowing and no, and just playing with the sounds of words. And again, just making Bolingbroke wait. Mark how I will undo myself. And again, long-winded, rather poetic, formulaic, perhaps. With my own tears I wash, with my own hands, with my own tongue, with my own breath. And he's giving up the pomp, the majesty. Again, he has to give us a description of that. It's a detailed explanation of all the things that he's resigning. A sense of ceremony and ritual about it, which is something Richard seems to have enjoyed all the way through. And then again, a rather fatalistic view, which we saw in Act 2, that once things are gone, he'll just die. Soon he'll lie Richard in an earthy pit. Northumberland wants to double down on things a bit, though. Again, rather practically, rather like Bolingbroke. He says, but actually you've just got to read this paper out with a kind of list of all the bad things you've done. Because there's a sense that they don't want, again, anybody to say, well, why did Richard resign? What did he do wrong? Oh, well, he's going to read out a list of his crimes. And again, Richard's rather reluctant to do that, but also perhaps enjoying delaying things further and making more of a self-pitying moment about this. Must I do so? Must I ravel out my weaved up follies? And again, he talks again. Notice Pilate comes back in, of course, was the person who judged that Jesus may or may not be killed. And again, now the impatience has passed over to Northumberland, as if maybe Bolingbroke's turned away in frustration, can't even engage with Richard anymore. Read over these articles, read this page out that we've written for you. And again, mine eyes are full of tears. Do we feel that is real? Is he playing still, or is there genuinely he's absolutely heartbroken at this moment where he's had to give up the kingship? And Northumberland, he always sounded quite impatient with Northumberland, who's a bit of a lackey and a suck-up. And ironically, he's part of the group who turn against Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, in the next play. So when he says, "My lord, no lord of thine, thou haught, insulting man," and so he's still got that ferocity and toughness, and often he's played as rather weak and effeminate on stage, and certainly was in the past. With effeminacy being associated with weakness in the past. But there's also some really ferocious language in the play, and I think it's a mistake to play him as somebody who is, even in terms of his spoken style, to be weak and uncertain and things like that. There's a real power and energy to his language at times. And so Richard, in his own moment, engaged with his moment, he wants to see himself, look himself in the mirror. Who am I now? And it's a pertinent philosophical question, but not one that really concerns Bolingbroke or Northumberland much. Of, well, who can I be now that I'm not king? I was king, and that was who I was, so what's left? So he asks for a mirror. Bolingbroke, again, in frustration, says, "Go, some of you fetch a looking lad, for God's sake, get the mirror, let's get this done." Again, Northumberland pushing him, read the paper. So there's this sense of them nudging and pushing him to do what they want, and Richard just evading that. And he says, again, metaphorically, well, yeah, I'll see my sins in the book of my face when I look in the mirror. And so they get a mirror, and he starts to, again, sort of say, well, no, I don't look that bad, really. Or maybe the mirror's flattering me, because and flattery, of course, is one of the underlying themes of the tragedy, that it's his flatterers that have led him to behave badly and to cause enemies to arise against him. Was this the face that, like the sun, did make beholders wink? Again, there's a sense there of power. He was powerful once. That's absolute tragedy for you. I was once powerful. I was once the sun, that people couldn't look at me without blinking. But now, what am I? And then he breaks the mirror, of course. So visually, on stage, we have that moment of the shattering of his image, the shattering of his self, and that sort of, very much a broken man. And so he says, "How soon my sorrow hath destroyed my face." So his face in the mirror has now been destroyed because it's been broken. And Bolingbroke can't resist, rather foolishly, from sort of correcting him that the metaphor doesn't really work, and he sort of be literal about this. It's just a shadow of your sorrow. It's just an image. It's just a mirror image. It's not real. You've just destroyed a picture of yourself, an image of yourself. And this is a beautiful moment, one of my favourite moments in the play, where Richard says, "Say that again. The shadow of my sorrow." Oh, let's see. 'Tis very true. My grief lies all within, and these external manners of laments are merely shadows. So, say that again. It's the moment in which Richard shows that language and thought are something in themselves interesting, and that the practicality of passing one kingship to another is irrelevant to this moment. He's really digging deep and thinking. He's a philosopher poet, not a king, but he's getting in the way of the man who wants to be king. And again, delaying the action quite deliberately in some respects. But we move through that scene, and finally he asks for just one more thing, which is just a leave to go. And he's hoping to just go off and crawl into a quiet spot and live out the rest of his life, but we know that that's not likely. He probably does too. That what happens with deposed kings is that they, in the end, have to be killed. Edward II, the last example of that in English history before Richard II, disappeared soon after his deposition, soon after he was deposed. He's no longer heard of, and there's again a little more so than Richard really. There's rumours about what did he die, what happened to his body. It's not really clear, but what is clear is that you can't really have a king on the throne and the person who was king still hanging about, because what will happen is what starts to happen at the end of the play, that their followers gain momentum and start trying to create a situation where they can reclaim the throne. So Richard is taken off. Bolingbroke prepares for the coronation in a really functional way, where Richard, everything seems to be ceremonial and worthy of a great long speech. He just says, "Yep, let's get ready. We'll get the coronation next Wednesday. Prepare yourselves." End of. But again, notably, that neither Richard nor Bolingbroke end the scene. Instead, we see Carlisle chatting with Armel and an abbot of Westminster, and he says, "Oh, come and talk to me, and we'll find out, what you think." And that's the beginnings of the rebellion against Bolingbroke, which is brewing towards the end of the play. That never really comes to a head, though. But ironically, head being the word, because it does lead to quite a few heads being chopped off. So this sense that the structure of each scene is important, and that often the sense is that where things might seem like they're being settled, they never are. There's always more to be said, and there's always more problems brewing. And here Bolingbroke, from the start of the scene where everything seemed chaotically unresolved, to the end of the scene where even his status as king is not certain, we feel that we haven't really gone from a weak regime into a strong one, but rather from one chaotic regime into another type of chaos. But as I keep saying, traditionally, rather sort of conservative historicist views of the play were to say the opposite and try and portray Richard as this weak, feeble king, and Bolingbroke as the sort of king that we've all been waiting for. It doesn't really work like that. And of course, post-20th century, when we've seen the horrors that can be inflicted by so-called strong leaders like Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and Stalin, etc., these terrible dictators who've caused masses of bloodshed, we are less likely to be enamoured of the idea of a strong leader in our culture anyway.